место расположения жизненно важных органов человека.
Он им беспризорный был, этот ребенок, и она его взрючила на меня.
За это надо было убивать! Вам не стыдно?
In late 2019, the trial of the oldest serial killer in Russia took place in Khabarovsk, an 80-year-old woman named Sofia Zhukova. The entire country, not to mention the world, was shocked by the brutality of this woman who killed all her victims with an axe in her own apartment, cutting their bodies into pieces and then simply packing the remains into bags and taking them to the garbage. She was as strong as men, had an unpleasant hoarse voice, and worked as a butcher at a pig farm. Her first victim was an 8-year-old girl who lived next door to her. The second victim was an elderly friend who came to visit her, and the third was a local janitor. All of them were hacked to death with an axe, and the reason for their murder was an arrogant look or the noise made by neighbors. At the trial, she laughed aloud at the relatives of her victims, showing no pity or remorse. In this episode, I will tell you in detail about the Russian Granny Ripper, Sofia Zhukova, stopping at each of her 3 heinous crimes and trying to get into the head of the oldest serial killer in the history of Russia. Let's start with Sofia Zhukova's childhood. Perhaps this is where the reason for her cruelty lies. Sofia was born in 1939 in one of the villages of the Nizhny Novgorod region and experienced the terrible times of the Great Patriotic War. Her father went to the front, her mother worked in the fields, so no one really took care of the girl's education and upbringing. Sofia only completed 2 classes of elementary school and could hardly read and write. She worked physically hard from childhood and grew up a very closed child. In general, her childhood was very difficult and left a lasting imprint on Sofia's character. In her 20s, she moved to Khabarovsk, settling in the suburb of Beryozovka. For a person without education, the choice of profession was limited. Therefore, young Sofia got a job at a pig farm in the meat processing department. Surprisingly, she was very strong physically and worked on equal terms with men. Hard work did not scare Sofia, and she worked at this place almost until retirement. As they say, there is no accounting for taste. Without having an attractive appearance, with an unpleasant character and hoarse voice, Sofia Zhukova soon got married and gave birth to 2 sons. It seemed that fate apologized to her for her difficult childhood, but in 2005 Sofia's husband died, and, as neighbors note, it was after this event that her behavior began to change dramatically. She shouted at the children that their heads and hands would be cut off if they didn't stop making noise, and no one could have thought that the threats of the pensioner would soon become a reality. It was a few weeks before New Year's Eve in 2005. 8-year-old Nastya Alexienko was returning home from school with her friend. Beryozovka is a small village, so the girls quickly reached home, said goodbye, and Nastya went into her entrance, but she never made it to her apartment. That was the last time anyone saw Nastya alive. The whole village searched for her, and during one of the interrogations, Nastya's friend told the investigators that on that very day, Grandma Sonia Zhukova entered the entrance right after the girl, and they immediately called her in for questioning. She confirmed that she really saw Nastya that day. They entered the entrance together, but according to the pensioner, someone yelled at the girl at the last moment, and she ran out onto the street. At that time, no one could have thought that the old woman gave false testimony to confuse the investigation, and approximately 2 weeks after the disappearance, they found little Nastya's dismembered body in bags on a dump. A resident of the village made the terrible discovery. The man was driving past and saw a large bag of meat on the roadside. You won't believe it, but the man took it home for his dogs, and only in his apartment did he realize what he had brought. The bag contained human remains, and despite his fear, the frightened man called the police and reported the terrible find. The bag with the pieces was confiscated, and the mother of the poor child confirmed the chopped pieces of meat. That was all that was left of her child. The murder of the schoolgirl shocked the whole of Russia, but the killer was never found. Sofia Zhukova remained at large and committed her next murder only 8 years later. 2013, the village of Beryozovka gradually returned to normal life 8 years after the brutal murder of a schoolgirl, and Sofia Zhukova's 70-year-old friend Anastasia Makieva came to visit her. She sold her apartment and was going to move to Moscow to live with her daughter, but while waiting for the documents to be reissued, she asked to stay at Sonia's house. However, soon Anastasia Mikieva disappeared without a trace, and her daughter raised the alarm, as she had not heard from her mother in Moscow. The last person to see Anastasia was the postman who delivered their pensions to both old ladies. Once again, Sofia Jukava was not punished. Detectives searched her apartment and found traces of Anastasia Mikieva's blood on the wall. Jukava explained this by saying that she had a conflict with her friend the day before the disappearance. Her friend's blood pressure had risen, and she had a nosebleed, but she had nothing to do with her disappearance. Allegedly, after the argument, Mikieva collected her things and left in an unknown direction. There was not enough evidence to charge Jukava, so she was released again. However, 6 years later, in a winter night in 2019, the Khabarovsk Baba Yaga made everyone talk about her again by committing her third bloody murder. Sofia's neighbors woke up to the sound of heavy blows and barely audible male groans. The victim was Vasily Shlyaktik, a local janitor. His roommate had kicked him out of the house and he had nowhere else to go, so he made a deal with Sofia to temporarily rent one of her rooms. Vasily paid 10,000 rubles to rent a room from Sofia, but after about a month, he suddenly stopped going to work. His phone became unavailable, and soon local schoolchildren discovered human remains near the dumpster. Dogs were gnawing on a human hand found in the bin, and pieces of the murdered janitor's body were discovered as well. This time Zhukov was immediately detained and sent to pretrial detention while the circumstances were investigated. During a search of the pensioner's apartment, the very same axe on which traces of Vasily's blood were found was discovered. Later, neighbors confirmed that after that fateful night when they heard strange noises from Jukava's apartment, they saw the old woman carrying heavy bags to the dump. During questioning in pretrial detention, Sofia Jukava sang old songs. At first, she claimed that she was cutting meat that night and knew nothing about the janitor's fate. But when she realized that she couldn't escape, she stated that her tenant got drunk and started to harass her, forcing her to defend herself. The investigation did not believe the pensioner's story, and an investigation began. It was soon discovered that evidence of past crimes remained in Jukava's apartment. For example, a pool of dried blood belonging to Anastasia, a missing friend of the pensioner, was found under the linoleum. Expert analysis showed that the shelves were fully packed with human flesh. Soon, the trial began for the oldest serial killer in Russian history. It is worth recalling that at the time of the last crime, Sofia Jukava was 80 years old. Initially, Jukava was only accused of killing 50-year-old janitor Vasily Shlyaktik, but later, other crimes were discovered. While in pretrial detention, Jukava managed to make friends with fellow inmates and received the nickname Sonia the Wheezer. In one of her frank conversations with her cellmates, she confessed to killing her elderly friend for her arrogance, claiming that the friend spoke to her in a condescending tone. But the most horrific thing she revealed was how she killed 8-year-old schoolgirl Nastia. The reason for her murder was the girl's too loud behavior, which irritated her. That day, she dragged the schoolgirl to her apartment and chopped her up with an axe, throwing the pieces off the balcony in the hope that stray dogs would consume the meat. This information did not stay within the prison, and detectives were informed. Throughout the investigation, the elderly maniac alternated between admitting her guilt and denying it, citing pressure from the investigation. Psychiatrists determined that Jukava was sane and did not understand the consequences of her actions. It was astonishing how she behaved during the court proceedings. During the trial, she promised to cut off the witness's head and ordered her to keep quiet. However, when the witness gave her testimony about the murdered person, the killer's mood suddenly improved. At first she smiled, then laughed out loud, covering her mouth with her hand when it became too loud. However, the killer never heard the verdict of the trial. In December 2020, Jukava contracted coronavirus, and the outcome was predictable. At the age of 81, Jukava died from the infection without ever hearing the verdict of the trial. Sofia's fame spread far beyond Russia, and media outlets in the UK and the US closely followed the trial, while local news was full of headlines like, "Russian Granny Ripper,